What if I told you that somewhere in the forgotten corners of musical history lies the story of a composer whose greatest works were born not from sound, but from the complete absence of it? A man who claimed that true music could only be found in perfect silence, and whose final composition drove listeners to madness with voices that shouldn't exist. Tonight, we delve into the disturbing tale of Erasmus Hollo, the musician who composed songs from silence itself. Our story begins in 1873 in the remote village of Greywick, nestled deep within the Yorkshire Dales. Erasmus Hollo was born into a world he would never hear. Deaf from birth, he grew up in a household where music was everything. His father was the village organist, his mother a renowned soprano who had once performed in London's finest theatres. Yet their son existed in a realm of absolute quiet. While other children learned lullabies and folk songs, Erasmus learned to feel vibrations through wooden floors and stone walls. He would place his hands against the church organ while his father practiced, absorbing the tremors that traveled through the instrument's massive frame. But it wasn't enough. The young man yearned for something his family couldn't understand. He didn't want to feel their music. He wanted to create his own dot. At the age of 21, Erasmus made a discovery that would change everything. While exploring the ancient crypt beneath Greywick's Norman church, he found something extraordinary. Carved into the stone walls were musical notations unlike anything he had ever seen. These weren't traditional notes, but strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the candlelight. The local priest, Father Aldrich, claimed he had never noticed them before. Though the church had stood for over 600 years, Erasmus became obsessed with these cryptic symbols. He spent months in that damp, cold crypt, copying every mark, every curve, every impossible angle. His family grew worried as he emerged each day paler and thinner, his eyes growing increasingly distant. But Erasmus had found his calling. He claimed these symbols represented a form of music that existed in the spaces between sounds, in the gaps where silence lived and breathed. His first composition came in 1875. He called it Hymn for the Unheard Congregation. The sheet music looked nothing like conventional notation. Instead, it consisted of those strange symbols arranged in flowing patterns across the page. When Erasmus presented it to the village musicians, they laughed. How could a deaf man compose music? How could anyone play notes that didn't exist? But Thomas Whitmore, the village's most accomplished violinist, was intrigued. Against his better judgment, he agreed to attempt a performance. The instructions were simple yet bizarre. Play the written notes, but focus on the silence between each one. Let the absence of sound carry the melody. Hold each rest as if it were the most important note in the piece. The performance took place. On a foggy October evening in 1875, a small audience gathered in the church, more curious than expectant. Whitmore raised his bow, positioned his fingers, and began to play. The first notes rang out clear and true, followed by an extended silence. Then another note, another pause. The pattern continued, but something was wrong. In those moments of silence, people began to hear things. First, it was just a whisper, barely perceptible. Then voices became clearer. Mrs. Hartwell swore she heard her deceased husband calling her name. Young Samuel Porter insisted his stillborn sister was singing to him from beyond the grave. One by one, every person in that church began to hear voices in the silence. Voices of the dead, calling out with desperate longing. The performance ended abruptly when Whitmore collapsed, his violin clattering to the stone floor. He would later claim that during those silences, he could see figures standing in the empty spaces between the pews, translucent forms of people he had never met, yet somehow recognized. The audience fled in terror, and word of the cursed performance spread throughout the Yorkshire Dales, but Erasmus wasn't deterred. If anything, the reaction convinced him that he had tapped into something profound. He began composing with renewed fervor, creating piece after piece of what he called silent symphony. Each composition grew more complex, with longer pauses and stranger symbols. He claimed that in his deaf world, he could hear these voices. More clearly than anyone, they spoke to him in the language of silence itself. The second public performance came 6 months later. This time, only the most curious and brave attended. The piece was called Requiem for the Living Dead, and it required 3 musicians playing simultaneously, but never at the same time. Each player would take turns creating sound, while the others maintained perfect silence. It was during these coordinated silences that the true horror began. The voices were no longer just calling names. They were having conversations. The audience heard deceased relatives discussing their deaths, describing the cold darkness of their graves, pleading to be remembered. Some voices belonged to people who were still alive, but who would die within the year. Mrs. Eleanor Gage heard her own voice describing her funeral, which would take place just 8 months later, exactly as the phantom voice predicted. Local authorities tried to ban Erasmus's performances, but he had gained a following among those fascinated by the supernatural. Secret concerts began taking place in abandoned buildings and remote locations. People traveled from across England to experience what they called the music of the dead. Some came seeking contact with lost loved ones. Others were driven by morbid curiosity. All left changed. Dr. Harrison Wells, a physician from Leeds who attended one such performance, documented his experience in a letter to the British Medical Journal. He wrote that during the silences, he heard conversations between patients he had lost over the years. They described their final moments in detail that no one else could have known. They thanked him for his care and forgave him for his failures. But, most disturbing of all, they warned him about patients he would lose in the future. Warnings that would prove horrifyingly accurate. As Erasmus's reputation grew, so did the strangeness surrounding him. People claimed he had begun to change. Physically, his already pale skin became almost translucent, his thin frame seemed to be wasting away, and his eyes developed an unusual quality. They reflected light like mirrors, showing not his own thoughts, but glimpses of the void he claimed to hear singing. His final composition was completed in the winter of 1870. He called it The Orchestra of Silence, Eternal. Unlike his previous works, this piece required no instruments at all. It was pure silence, broken only by the sounds the audience would bring with them, their breathing, their heartbeats, the rustle of their clothing. According to Erasmus, these everyday sounds would serve as a foundation upon which the voices of the dead could build their symphony. The premiere was scheduled for the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. It would take place in the same crypt where Erasmus had first discovered the mysterious symbols. Word spread through underground networks of spiritualists and curiosity seekers. By the appointed night, nearly 50 people had gathered in that cramped, ancient space beneath the church. Erasmus took his place at the front of the crypt. Standing beside a music stand that held blank pages, he raised his hands as if conducting an invisible orchestra, then lowered them to signal the beginning. What followed was perhaps the most terrifying hour in the history of music. The silence was unlike anything the audience had ever experienced. It seemed to have weight and texture, pressing down on them like a physical presence. Within minutes, the voices began. But these weren't the familiar tones of deceased relatives. These voices spoke in languages that had been dead for centuries, in dialects that predated human civilization. The audience heard the final words of plague victims, the death rattles of medieval knights, the last prayers of forgotten saints. As the performance continued, people began to see, as well as hear, the crypt filled with translucent figures, not just human forms, but creatures that defied description. Some appeared to be made of shadow and starlight. Others seemed constructed from the very concept of absence itself. They moved through the audience, touching faces with fingers that felt like cold vacuum, whispering secrets that the living were never meant to know. The performance reached its climax when Erasmus himself began to change. His pale skin became completely transparent, revealing not flesh and bone beneath, but an emptiness so profound that it hurt to look upon. The voices grew to a deafening roar of perfect silence, a contradiction that drove several audience members to madness. They could hear everything and nothing simultaneously, the sound of their own thoughts, becoming indistinguishable from the voices of the dead. When dawn broke and the performance finally ended, 23 people were found catatonic in the crypt. They had to be carried out by rescuers, their minds apparently lost to whatever they had experienced in that terrible silence. 12 others suffered permanent hearing loss, not from loud sounds, but from the complete absence of them. Their ears had somehow forgotten how to process noise, leaving them trapped in a world as silent as Erasmus's own. But Erasmus himself was gone. His clothes remained on the spot where he had been conducting, but there was no body to be found. Some claimed he had simply dissolved into the silence he had spent his life exploring. Others insisted he had joined the chorus of voices that lived in the spaces between sounds. The mysterious symbols in the crypt were found to be fresh carvings, despite appearing ancient. They had been carved not into the stone, but through it, creating holes that seemed to extend infinitely downward. When local authorities attempted to fill these gaps with mortars, the substance would simply disappear, as if the holes consumed anything that tried to occupy their space. Father Aldrich, the local priest, ordered the crypt to be sealed permanently, but sealing it couldn't contain what had been unleashed. People throughout Greywick began reporting strange auditory experiences. They would hear faint music in moments of perfect quiet, not melodies, but the architectural structure of songs. Built from silence itself, children born in the village after 1878 often showed signs of unusual hearing. They could detect sounds that didn't exist and seemed to carry on conversations with invisible companions. The sheet music for Erasmus's compositions was gathered and burned by church authorities, but copies had already been made and circulated. Among collectors of occult materials, throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were sporadic reports of performances attempting to recreate his work. None were entirely successful, but each seemed to open small tears in the fabric between the world of sound and the realm of infinite silence. Dr. James Morton, a researcher into paranormal phenomena at Cambridge University, spent 15 years tracking down these performances and their effects. His findings, published posthumously in 1923, suggested that Erasmus had discovered a fundamental truth about the nature of reality. That silence wasn't simply the absence of sound, but a living force that existed parallel to our world of noise and vibration. According to Morton's research, the human ear is designed to ignore the voices that speak in perfect quiet. We've evolved to filter out the constant whispers of the dead, the songs of creatures that exist in emptiness, the music that plays in the spaces between atoms. But Erasmus, in his world of enforced silence, had learned to hear what others could not. His compositions were attempts to translate this hidden symphony for those trapped in the world of sound. The village of Greywick was eventually abandoned in 1941 during the Second World War. Official records claim it was due to economic factors, but local sources suggest that the constant auditory disturbances had made normal life impossible. Residents reported that the silence itself had become aggressive, actively consuming sounds and leaving behind an emptiness that felt hungry for more. Today, the ruins of Greywick stand empty in the Yorkshire Dales. The church still stands, its crypt sealed behind layers of concrete and steel. But hikers and explorers who venture too close report strange experiences. In moments of perfect quiet, when the wind dies and even the insects fall silent, they claim to hear something impossible. It's the sound of an orchestra tuning up, preparing for a performance that will never begin. It's the whisper of voices calling names of people who haven't been born yet. It's the music of silence itself, still playing Erasmus Hollow's eternal composition for anyone brave or foolish enough to listen. Some say that if you stand in the ruins of Greywick on the winter solstice, in the hour before dawn, when the world is at its most quiet, you can still hear Erasmus conducting his invisible orchestra. His hands move through the air, shaping silence into something that resembles music but exists beyond the realm of human understanding. The question isn't whether his music was real or simply the product of mass hysteria and suggestion. The question is whether there really is a difference between the two. In a world where sound defines reality, what happens when someone learns to compose with its complete absence? What melodies hide in the spaces between our heartbeats? What songs play in the pause between one breath and the next? Erasmus Hollow found the answers to these questions, and in doing so, he may have opened a door that can never be fully closed. His legacy lives on, not in concert halls or recording studios, but in the quiet moments when the world falls silent and something else begins to sing. The next time you find yourself in perfect quiet, listen carefully. You might hear more than you bargained for. And if you begin to hear voices calling your name from the silence itself, remember the story of the musician who composed songs from nothing at all, because in the end, Erasmus Hollow proved that the most powerful music isn't heard with the ears, but felt in the spaces where sound fears to go. His symphony continues to play, even now, in the silence that surrounds us all.